The main character of Goodfellas, Henry Hill, spent years working for the mob, only to betray everyone in the end, as is often the case in Scorsese films. The scene you're seeing is from the very start of the movie. Hill is introducing his business partners to the audience. Among them is a heavyset man with a mustache. That's Fat Andy, a nod to a real-life gangster from the Gambino crime family, one of the most powerful mafia clans in New York. What makes it even more interesting is who plays him. It's not a professional actor, it's a cop named Louis Ippolito. That's right, a police officer playing a mobster. But there's more. Ippolito's grandfather, father, and uncle were all part of that same Gambino family, robbing people and getting rid of anyone who stood in their way. Louis was expected to follow in their footsteps, but instead, he broke the mold and joined the police force. From that moment on, his entire family saw him as the enemy. Over time, he grew disillusioned with life as a cop, and then, by chance, he met actor Joe Pesci. They got to talking, and one thing led to another. Ippolito was invited to the set of Goodfellas. After the movie, he quit the force, wrote a book, and went on to appear in 10 more films. A movie about the mob gave a cop a new career. Yeah, about that. Because 15 years after Goodfellas hit theaters, Ippolito and his partner were sentenced to life in prison. Turns out, at least since the mid-80s, they've been doing jobs for the mob. These dirty cops were responsible for at least 8 hits. They regularly leaked info on planned raids, snitches, and other sensitive police operations. So yes, one of the most corrupt officers in New York history actually played a gangster in a Scorsese film. We've taken our time getting to the topic of the Italian-American mafia, and I've spent a while figuring out how to approach it. The Sopranos, The Godfather, Goodfellas, and a whole library of crime cinema. That's when it hit me. When people talk about the Italian mafia, they're usually not thinking about real gangsters. Look, there are plenty of actual thugs out there, guys who broke laws, ran protection rackets, and made dirty money. That fits plenty of gangs, from Los Angeles to El Salvador to Mexico. Why they robbed and killed? That depends on the context. But dry retellings of court documents and police files? That stuff's only interesting to their lawyers. When it comes to the Italian mafia, what fascinates us isn't the crime, it's the aesthetic. It's not about what the mob did, but how film and TV turned it into legend. That's why we decided to go beyond the facts, to explore how reality blended with pop culture, and where the movie version lines up with the truth. Today, we'll look at the real history of the mafia and how it compares to the iconic image we've seen on screen. What do crime films get right, and what's pure fiction? Where did the stereotype of every Sicilian being a mafioso come from? Could someone really kill a mob boss and get away with it? And how does a crime family leader retire anyway? We'll also talk about what gangsters actually did with concrete, and who really got the kiss of death. Hope you enjoy the episode. What are the first 2 cities that come to mind when we talk about the Italian mafia in the US? First, New York. Second, Chicago. Al Capone, bootlegging wars. But the truth is, the first place where the mafia was recognized as a serious force wasn't either of those. It was the port city of New Orleans, way down south. That's where Italian immigrants, fleeing agricultural collapse and high taxes in southern Italy, started arriving in large numbers. As early as 1869, local newspapers were raising alarms, claiming that criminals from Sicily were taking over entire neighborhoods. Southern Italians banded together in street gangs to rob, steal, and kill. 12 years later, the city witnessed the largest mass lynching in American history. 11 Sicilians were murdered by a mob. In New Orleans, they were seen as scum. Who were these sunny Sicilian newcomers in the eyes of locals? Migrant workers willing to do back-breaking labor for pennies. In effect, cheap, disposable labor. Racism ran so deep that even black residents reportedly joined the lynch mob. The excuse? The murder of the city's police chief. He'd been investigating a turf war between 2 Italian clans. Just before he died, he reportedly said that some Dagos were on his tail, an ethnic slur used at the time for anyone from the Mediterranean. 19 men ended up on trial, most of them completely innocent. just people who happened to live near the crime scene. When the case started to fall apart and the jury began handing out acquittals, the public was convinced the mafia had bribed and intimidated everyone in court. Even the mayor of New Orleans openly encouraged vigilante justice. For decades, Hollywood avoided this story. It wasn't until about 25 years ago that it made it to the screen. In that version, the lynching was orchestrated by a powerful local businessman. He wanted control of the port operations run by an Italian. When the courts didn't give him what he wanted, he used the mayor to spark mob violence. And that conspiracy theory isn't just fiction. Those docs really did end up in the hands of the same people who incited the lynch mob. The local press actively defended the killings. Major newspapers claimed that vigilante justice was the only option because the Sicilians had already taken over the city with their mafia. And so, it was only fair to fight back, an eye for an eye. From then on, the media began using mafia as a catch-all label. If a 12-year-old Sicilian boy stole a couple of oranges, it was because his mafia bosses told him to. No other explanation. That said, it's true. The mafia already had a bad reputation. In 1906, a short film called The Black Hand, a true story of a recent occurrence in the Italian quarter of New York, was released. It's widely considered America's first gangster movie. The plot: two Italians threaten a butcher. Either he pays them $1,000, which would be about $40,000 today, or they'll blow up his shop and kidnap his daughter. In the letter, they draw a skull and crossbones and sign it, The Black Hand. This was based on real life. Successful Italians in immigrant neighborhoods often received those kinds of letters, with actual black handprints or skull drawings. And back then, fingerprinting wasn't really a thing yet. This extortion tactic was brought over to the US by migrants from southern Italy. The early mafia made a lot of money off it, partly through basic threats, but also through more clever tricks. Sometimes the criminals themselves would send the threatening letter and then show up posing as protectors, offering their help for a lower price. Forget those animals. We'll keep you safe for half the cost. Classic manipulation. Create the problem, then offer the solution. That kind of racket, protection for a fee, became known as pizzo, from the Sicilian word for beak, based on the phrase, wetting the beak. The idea wasn't to rob someone once, it was to take a cut of their profits regularly in exchange for safety. Many believe organized, structured racketeering in the US started with Southern Italians. Skim the cream off the milk without breaking the bottle. Offer them protection, help their business thrive, and not only will they pay, you'll have them kissing your hand in gratitude. Those words are often attributed to the legendary Don Vito. He was seen as a tough but wise and fair mafia boss, someone who only resorted to violence when absolutely necessary. People feared him, but they also respected him. And yes, some really did kiss his hand. In America, Don Vito had business ties with another mobster, Giuseppe Morello. In 1905, Morello founded one of New York's most powerful crime families. He turned the pizzo model into a system, introducing fixed weekly payments from businesses. One of his men inspired the character Don Fanucci in The Godfather Part 2. In that scene, Fanucci tells young Vito Corleone it's time to wet the beak, that is, pay up. By the way, Corleone isn't just the name of a fictional godfather. It's also a small town near Palermo, the capital of Sicily. In real life, several high-ranking mafiosi who later ran New York crime families came from Corleone, including Giuseppe Morello, one of the founding figures of the American Cosa Nostra. Before we go any further, a quick spoiler warning. If you haven't seen The Godfather, go watch that masterpiece and then come back to this video. I mean it because I'm about to spoil it relentlessly. I'll be more gentle with other films, but not this one. So, in The Sopranos, arguably the greatest gangster show ever made, there's a scene where a character gets officially inducted into the mafia. Even though he was practically a son to the boss, he had to earn that moment over years. They prick his finger, burn a saint's card in his palm, and make him repeat,
"May I burn in hell.
May I burn in hell.
If I betray my friends.
If I betray my friends."
A real former mobster once weighed in on that scene.
Some of the things were accurate that was said, and obviously the pricking of the finger and the burning of the saint, but all in all, it wasn't 100%.
The blood, the fire, the oath. But a lot of it felt theatrical, like old-school Sicilian drama set in early 2000s New Jersey. And believe it or not, even in 2025, that initiation ritual is still practiced. The details vary from family to family, but one thing never changes: Omertà, the code of silence. Never testify against another made man. In October 1989, the FBI secretly recorded one of these ceremonies, and it was even darker than what you see in TV dramas. The process is called a baptism, and the recruit is asked, "Would you kill your own brother for this family?" A trick question. What if your brother is already in the mob? That kind of thing happened all the time. Many joined because their fathers, uncles, or cousins were already in. Bloodlines were everything. Take Goodfellas, for example. Henry Hill, based on a real person, was never made. Despite years of loyal service, he remained an associate, a partner, not family. His mom was Sicilian, but his dad was Irish, and that disqualified him. The Mafia had a strict blood and soil rule, full-blooded Italians only. And even that was a stretch. Traditionally, you had to be pure Sicilian. No Northern Italians, and certainly no Calabrians, who were seen as second-rate and had their own crime syndicate, the 'Ndrangheta. The Sicilians looked down on them like elite Northern football clubs, mocking gritty Southern rivals. To get made, you had to get your button, also called earning your bones, and that meant killing someone. It proved you were serious and not an undercover cop. But even then, you needed a sponsor from within the family to vouch for you during your trial period as an associate. If all went well, you became a made man, uomo d'onore, a man of honor, a wise guy, a button. What came next? Depends on the hierarchy. At the top is the boss, or acting boss, if the real one's out of commission. Under him is the underboss, his right-hand man. Then there's the consigliere, the advisor, kind of like a mafia prime minister. Notice how there's no clear number two. Power is split between the underboss and the consigliere, which keeps them competing and strengthens the boss's control. This trio forms the executive board. Below them are the capos, captains who run crews of soldiers. These soldiers do the dirty work. Orders flow from the top to capos, then to soldiers. Then there are the associates, the unofficial members. But rank didn't always equal influence. Some soldiers made millions and had direct access to the boss. Even someone like Meyer Lansky, the unofficial founder of Las Vegas, was only an associate because he wasn't Italian. Known as the Mafia's accountant, Lansky worked directly with the mob elite. If you want a full video on Lansky and his partner Bugsy Siegel, let us know in the comments. Back to ranks, how long you stayed a soldier or a capo wasn't fixed. Some stayed soldiers for life to avoid the pressure of leadership, but still made plenty. Climbing the ladder only really mattered if you had your eye on the top job. The Godfather Part 2 lays out this hierarchy well through the Corleone family. But even within one family, structure varied. Some had street bosses handling operations while the real boss stayed behind the scenes. In The Sopranos, Tony was seen as a street boss by the FBI, while Old School Jr. wore the boss title but mostly served as a decoy. The role of consigliere was also more hands-on in real life. Take Tom Hagen, Vito Corleone's adopted son in Consigliere. He was the peacemaker, the legal mind, the diplomat. But in reality, a consigliere had to be made. And Hagen, being of German-Irish descent, wouldn't qualify, no matter how close he was to the Don.
The consigliere is a real position. You got to take the oath and become a made member in order to be consigliere. Well, Robert Duvall in this, he wasn't even Italian, and you can't become a made guy unless you're Italian.
Real consigliere were often ruthless enforcers, sometimes planning hits or delivering messages personally. Killing a made man required special permission from the boss. That's why Joe Pesci's character in Goodfellas, based on the real Tommy DeSimone, was whacked. He crossed a line. But for all the rules, there were plenty of times when even bosses were taken out in what mob historians politely call extrajudicial actions. In The Godfather, Michael Corleone wipes out the heads of New York's 5 families in one swift, bloody move. That scene was inspired by something real, the Castellammarise War. I won't bore you with the full timeline. It'd be like trying to explain Game of Thrones to someone who's never seen a single episode. Too many names, too many betrayals, and you'd lose track halfway through. So let's stick to what matters, how that mob war reshaped the Italian-American mafia in the 20th century. First, it marked the rise of the Young Turks. No, not the Ottoman-era reformers or the deep state origins we covered in another episode. This was the name given to a younger generation of Italian gangsters who grew up in the US. They had a different worldview. For one, they didn't care about the old-school Sicilian rulebook. They were willing to do business with non-Italians. This was the melting pot effect. These guys didn't come up in dusty southern Italian villages. They cut their teeth on the streets of New York, clashing with Irish gangs from day one. So when the old-timers started ranting about tradition, the Young Turks just rolled their eyes. That world was gone. The second big outcome of the war was the rise of a young, ambitious boss, Lucky Luciano. He took over what became the mafia's governing body, the Commission. It included the heads of New York's 5 families, the Chicago outfit, and the Buffalo family. The idea was to oversee all mob activity nationwide. The Godfather gives us a glimpse of this system. Don Corleone sits at the table while the Commission discusses family disputes. Naturally, Luciano took the chair first. And sometimes even non-Italians were allowed in, like Meyer Lansky. For that era, it was peak liberalism and ethnic tolerance by mob standards. By then, the Mafia already had something like a hit squad. The press dubbed it Murder, Inc. Some say they racked up over 500 kills. By 1943, they were already part of pop culture. That year, a brutally dark animated parody of Snow White came out. In it, the evil queen hires Murder, Inc. to off her stepdaughter. They roll up in a van that says, "We rub out anybody for $1. Midgets, half price. Japs, free." It was 1943, right after Pearl Harbor. So yeah, not subtle. But maybe it was a wink at the Mafia's cooperation with the US government during World War II. The feds feared sabotage at the ports, which the mob basically ran. In return for Mafia help, Lucky Luciano, who was in prison at the time, had his sentence reduced. He was released after the war on the condition he'd be deported to Sicily. That's the melting pot for you. War or no war, lunch is still at noon. And when it comes to Italians and food, the stereotype is very real. Just think of Clemenza in The Godfather, lovingly cooking for the crew, or Al Pacino's wine-soaked chicken in Donnie Brasco. In Goodfellas, one of the guy's moms seats everyone for dinner, while a half-dead man is bleeding out in the trunk. And the cherry on top? That gourmet prison meal in Goodfellas, too. There's a reason food shows up so often in mafia films. These guys love to cook and eat well. Real-life mobster Henry Hill collected recipes during his years with the family and later published them in a cookbook you can still buy today.
Mob guys always thought that men were the best cooks. And we like to cook a lot, got in the kitchen, we cooked, and we always talked about food. Italians do that anyway, but mob guys really like to cook.
Even in the middle of brutal gang wars, wise guys kept going to restaurants, knowing full well they might get clipped there. That's how the rebellious capo Joey Gallo met his end, shot dead in a Little Italy restaurant. At least he got one last plate of carbonara. Mob conflicts never ran dry. Leadership came with a bullseye on your back. Sure, the helicopter hit in The Godfather is pure Hollywood. Nobody ever wiped out the entire commission in one go. A former member of the Lucchese family even confirmed it.
It was very Hollywood to me with the helicopter and the machine guns. This would never happen. It would be very low-key and be done quietly.
Still, life at the top wasn't exactly safe. Remember that garage massacre scene in Some Like It Hot? That was based on the real St. Valentine's Day massacre. On February 14, 1929, Al Capone's men executed 7 rival gang members in a Chicago warehouse disguised as a garage. 2 shooters wore police uniforms to avoid suspicion. That trick, posing as cops, wasn't just a movie invention. The Godfather scene with fake cops? Totally plausible. The Chicago hit shocked the country and forced the government to act. It pushed the downfall of Capone, even though no one was officially charged. Rumor has it Capone personally beat some of the hitmen to death with a baseball bat. That urban legend became a key scene in Brian De Palma's The Untouchables, which dramatized the Fed's fight against Capone during Prohibition. The film shows Treasury agents trying to bring Capone down through bootlegging charges, but it plays fast and loose with the facts. Yes, journalists really called Ness's squad the Untouchables because they refused bribes and shrugged off threats. And yes, they caused serious financial damage, allegedly costing Capone over $9 million, which today would be close to $200 million. Ness really did gather the evidence needed to lock him up, but in reality that evidence was never used in court. That's a major difference from the movie. Ness didn't personally take down Capone. There were no epic shootouts or face-to-face standoffs. Capone was more worried about rival gangs than the Treasury Department. The only time Ness and Capone met face-to-face was when Capone was being transferred to Atlanta prison. So how did all these uneducated blue-collar criminals make millions of dollars? Let's break it down. The Mafia went after anything that wasn't nailed down, especially anything illegal. Underground lotteries, bookmaking, prostitution. The government had pushed those industries outside the legal economy, and that's where the black market took over. No taxes, no laws, no accountability. Add to that the usual extortion, loan sharking, racketeering, and straight-up robbery. Let's break down the core revenue streams. The big break that turned the Mafia into a true criminal empire came from the US government itself in 1920, Prohibition. By the mid-1920s, New York alone had nearly 100,000 speakeasies. I didn't believe it either, especially considering that as of summer 2025, the city has around 4,000 bars. But that insane figure, 100,000, is documented in the US National Archives. Now it makes sense why the Chicago outfit was pulling in $70 million a year from bootlegging. Over $1 billion in today's money. Then came drugs. Cosa Nostra was dealing long before the booze boom. Over time, they built roots through Cuba and Sicily. Some bosses opposed the drug trade, like Vito Corleone, who warned it would ruin their reputation and scare off politicians. Some families even banned it. Remember in Goodfellas, when the capo warns the main character, "Stay away from that shit," not just because it's dirty business, but because drug charges brought heavy prison time. And that wrecked the whole operation. But in reality, most families dealt anyway. Dirty money needed laundering. No one wanted to end up like Al Capone. Vito Corleone had his olive oil business, modeled after Joe Profaci, founder of the Colombo family known as the Olive Oil King. After World War II, demand skyrocketed, and the front became profitable on its own. Americans buying olive oil for their salads had no idea who was cashing in. Same way people buying avocados today don't realize Mexican cartels often run the supply chain. Another classic laundering method, restaurants. Every self-respecting mobster had at least one, or better, a few. They brought real profit, clean dirty money, and gave crews a hangout for meetings, like the Bada-Bing strip club in The Sopranos. Real-life mob boss Frank Costello, through frontmen, owned the legendary Copacabana in New York, the go-to mafia night spot. Ray Liotta's character even visits it in Goodfellas. Here's how restaurant laundering worked. Simple but effective. Back when most customers paid in cash, a restaurant would have real daily revenue. The mobster would mix in a small portion of illegal income with the legit take and deposit it all in the bank. The trick? Don't overdo it. If your place makes $10,000 a day and you throw in an extra $30,000, that's a red flag. Smart guys kept it subtle, just enough to disappear into the books. But food and entertainment weren't everything. Funeral homes were also big business. Buffalo boss Stefano Magaddino was nicknamed The Undertaker. The Bonanno family even used double-decker caskets in their funeral homes, stacking corpses to dispose of bodies quietly. As morbid as it gets. But the gold standard of laundering was, and still is, casinos. We covered that in another episode. There, bosses skim profits, literally taking cash off the top before it hit the books. In Casino, Scorsese shows this. A guy walks into the count room with a suitcase and just walks out with cash. That was skimming long before it referred to stealing card data from ATMs. In The Godfather, the Corleone family tries to move into Vegas through Mo Green, based on real gangster Bugsy Siegel, who helped build the Nevada casino industry. With mob money, Siegel built the lavish Flamingo Hotel. In the movie, Mo gets whacked for refusing to sell. In real life, Siegel was killed for skimming too much from the Flamingo. His fate came up at the infamous Havana Conference in 1946, where mob bosses from across America met in Cuba. Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky had invested heavily in Cuban gambling in the 30s, and by the 40s, they had dictator Batista in their pocket. Through those casinos, they laundered millions, sending the money back to the U.S. as clean investments. But it didn't last. Batista was overthrown in the Cuban Revolution. The mob didn't take it lightly. They backed anti-Castro groups and even tried to pay for his assassination. This story appears in The Good Shepherd and The Company, and it's not just fiction. Declassified CIA files show the agency really did try to use the mob to take out Fidel. Chicago boss Sam Giancana allegedly tried twice to poison him, but failed. As for JFK, some believe the mafia got that job done. Conspiracy theorists point to Jack Ruby, the guy who killed Lee Harvey Oswald, as evidence that Cosa Nostra was tying up loose ends. The theory goes, Oswald wasn't just a lone nut, he was a pawn. But why would they want JFK dead? One version says the mob helped him win the election and got nothing in return. Worse, his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, ramped up prosecutions, so they retaliated. Do we have hard proof? Not really. No tapes, no files, just internet deep dives. But the cinematic image of a boss pulling political strings isn't far off. Al Capone bankrolled William Thompson, a Republican who ran Chicago in the late 20s, while Capone's goons threatened opponents and disrupted elections. In New York, the mob had deep ties to Democratic candidates. Frank Costello was the most active, nicknamed the Prime Minister of the Underworld. Whether the mafia really helped the Kennedys or not, we'll likely never know. No one filed receipts for black market campaign contributions, but they had everything they needed. Not just money, knives, and guns, but something even more powerful. Marlon Brando became a star 2 decades before The Godfather, playing a washed-up boxer in On the Waterfront, a man forced to throw a fight under pressure from mobbed-up bookies. After that, he gets work on the docks, which of course are also run by the mob. The villain of the film was based on real-life gangster Anthony Anastasio, who controlled most of Brooklyn's docks through his role in the International Longshoremen's Association. Another inspiration was Johnny Dio, a key player in helping the infamous Jimmy Hoffa take over the Teamsters union, which at its peak had over 2 million members. Hoffa ran the union for over a decade. Rumors about his mob ties swirled for years. He even did time for bribery, jury tampering, and fraud. Then in 1975, Hoffa vanished. It's believed the mafia took him out, but the body was never found, and the mystery only fueled urban legends. You've probably heard jokes about Hoffa in everything from Bruce Almighty to Hellboy. The Sopranos even slipped in a nod. When Tony's in surgery, his doctor jokes he found Jimmy Hoffa in there. But the crime was eventually solved. In 2003, Frank Sheeran, a union enforcer with deep mob ties, confessed to killing Hoffa. His story became the basis for the book that Scorsese adapted into The Irishman, which made one thing clear: unions and the mafia were tight for decades. But why would the mob need unions? Simple. They were perfect for quietly bleeding major corporations. Want to avoid a strike? Pay up. They also gave gangsters cover jobs. On paper, guys had real employment, steady paychecks, and full benefits, even if they never showed up. The real-life Henry Hill was listed as a bricklayer union member, pulling in $200 a week, about $2,000 today. Another cash cow? Pension and insurance funds. Through union control, Cosa Nostra embedded itself in everything from trash collection and dry cleaning to trucking and textiles. But their favorite racket? Concrete. And no, not just for disposing of bodies, though that was real too. In the early 80s, the mob controlled nearly every major concrete contract in New York. Only contractors who paid kickbacks got the work. They even seized control of the production itself. Mafia bosses used to brag, "No building goes up in Manhattan without our concrete, including Trump Tower." All of that came from dominating the construction drivers and cement workers' unions. That's when the famous Godfather Part 2 quote started to sound more like fact than fiction.
Michael,
We're bigger than U.S. Steel.
By the mid-1980s, the Italian-American Mafia's annual revenue topped $50 billion. That's not just bigger than U.S. Steel. It was bigger than the combined markets of aluminum, iron, and copper in the U.S. But then came the commission trial of 1985. 8 major mafia figures didn't just get fined, they got 100-year prison sentences each. Why? Because they started breaking the one rule that had protected them for generations: Omertà. From this day forward, Joe Valachi, you will live by the gun and the knife, and die by the gun or the knife. That scene comes from the Valachi Papers, directed by the man behind the first 2 Bond films. It's based on the real-life testimony of Joe Valachi, the first made man to publicly confirm that the mafia exists. In the fall of 1963, Valachi testified before a U.S. Senate committee, and his revelations about the mafia's inner workings were broadcast nationwide. He detailed the initiation rituals, the clan hierarchy, the 5 families of New York, the mob wars, and the massive reach of Cosa Nostra, the term he popularized. Mobsters didn't call themselves the mafia. They used Cosa Nostra, Sicilian for our thing. Why did Valachi break Omertà? Not out of conscience or justice. In the late 50s, he got busted for drugs and landed in the same prison as his boss, who started suspecting Valachi of betrayal. In the film, the boss kisses him in prison. The infamous kiss of death, a silent death sentence for a rat. That's where The Godfather Part 2 got the idea. When Michael kisses Fredo, he knows he'll have to kill him. Coppola admitted that the Senate hearings in the movie were inspired by Valachi, though not just him. 13 years earlier, Americans watched real mob bosses get grilled on live TV and were stunned by how powerful the mafia truly was. Marlon Brando even said he studied those hearings for his role, mimicking the speech of Frank Costello. There's a good chance 7-year-old Henry Hill, real-life inspiration for Ray Liotta's character in Goodfellas, was watching too, and he'd go on to change the mob forever. Hill eventually flipped, joined witness protection, and testified against his old crew. After that, the floodgates opened. Underbosses, advisors, acting bosses, all cutting deals. The final nail came when Joseph Massino, head of the Bonanno family, became the first New York boss to turn informant. His motives? Plain survival, avoid the death penalty, and protect his family's assets. That was all it took to toss centuries of tradition. Some turncoats didn't even bother hiding, giving interviews, writing books, popping up on talk shows, all claiming the same thing. They didn't betray honor, the mafia betrayed them. No more men of honor, just snitches and setups. Henry Hill, even under witness protection, stayed in the spotlight. He worked closely with journalist Nicholas Pileggi, whose true crime book Wise Guy inspired Scorsese's Goodfellas. Hill even coached the actors over the phone during production and showed up to meet them before the premiere, no doubt feeding his ego. But none of that, Goodfellas, this video, or any of the modern mob mythology would exist if The Godfather hadn't hit screens in 1972, which raises a real question. How did that even happen? Why would the real-life mob let a film expose so much of their world? In May 1961, protesters stormed ABC's headquarters. They were outraged over the TV series The Untouchables, accusing the network of spreading toxic Italian stereotypes. Among the protesters were port workers and dockers. But don't let that fool you. Behind the pressuring of media and journalists stood Anthony Anastasio, the same union boss we mentioned earlier. In the end, the show's main sponsor, LM Cigarettes, pulled their ads, and ABC quickly got the message. They released a statement promising fewer Italian gangsters and more upstanding Italian-American crime fighters. It wasn't the first time the mob tried PR by intimidation. Back in the 1930s, Capone's crew monitored the making of Scarface because the villain was loosely based on their boss. Same story with The Godfather. Trouble began as soon as Paramount announced plans to adapt Mario Puzo's novel. Italian-American politicians, judges, and businessmen bombarded the studio with angry letters and threats of lawsuits and boycotts. And then came the mob. Calls, threats, smashed windows, Classic persuasion. Around the same time, the head of the Colombo family founded the Italian-American Civil Rights League to fight so-called discrimination. The league held 50,000-person rallies and got government agencies to stop using words like mafia and Cosa Nostra in press releases. Euphemisms only. The Don himself gave interviews, signed autographs, even bought his way into being named Man of the Year by a tabloid. Imagine what Capone would have done with access to 1970s media. The Godfather film couldn't escape the spotlight. Alongside legal pressure came intimidation, phone calls, threats to Paramount, producers being followed, even having their car windows smashed. Ironically, Puzo's book was a bestseller among mobsters. He said they sent him champagne, paid off his casino debts, and invited him to sit-downs. They loved the novel, so why all the hate for the film? Same reason anyone raises hell in business. They wanted love and respect. Once producers met with Colombo and agreed to cut the word mafia from the script, everything calmed down. They even pledged to donate part of the profits to the league's foundation. Voila, problem solved. Permits were granted, restrictions lifted, and the film was back on track. Real mobsters even showed up on set, not just from the Colombo crew, but others too. They were genuinely fascinated and felt like part of the process. Marlon Brando and the cast got to absorb that real energy. It felt like one big happy family. Mob guys loved the criminal characters. And clearly the criminals loved Hollywood. Some even made it on screen. Take Lenny Montana, who played Luca Brasi. He was a real-life enforcer for the Colombo family. Or Gianni Russo, who played Don Corleone's hot-headed son-in-law, another guy with deep mob ties. The whole chaotic backstory was dramatized in the 2022 series, The Offer. A lot of it's true, including the time Frank Sinatra confronted Puzo in a Hollywood restaurant and threatened him after realizing Johnny Fontaine was based on him. Not exactly the image of the romantic baritone, but there's truth in that rage. After all, the mob really did help Sinatra get out of an early contract, reportedly at gunpoint. Like that Chekhov story, The Grasshopper, where a writer cryptically exposed a real affair and sparked drama. Not everything in The Godfather is based on fact, though. The severed horse head in the bed? Pure fiction. But what made the film work was how it mixed blood ties with bloodshed. Sonny was impulsive, but rushed to protect his sister. Michael seemed cold, but stepped into the family business when it mattered. That's why the Mafia loved the movie. Finally, they were humanized. In The Godfather Part 2, Michael ultimately decides to have his own brother killed. Fredo betrayed him. Sure, Michael waited until their mother passed, out of respect. He made sure Fredo's family was cared for. Maybe he would have forgiven him, but that might have looked weak. Mafia culture doesn't reward weakness. You'll find this theme again and again. In The Sopranos, Tony chokes Christopher to death, a guy he raised like a son. Chris had sacrificed everything for his boss. Even the woman he loved didn't matter. In Gotti, the old-timer tells young John Gotti, "I love you like a son, but if the boss says to whack you, I'll do it." Donnie Brasco? Al Pacino's character explains that in the Mafia, it's your closest friend who'll take you out. And that's not just movie talk. Donnie Brasco is based on a true story. FBI agent Joe Pistone infiltrated the Bonanno family in the late 70s, and after he was exposed, the guys who brought him in got killed. One was taken out by his own cousin, also a made man. Blood ties don't override orders. Legendary mob boss Frank Costello even greenlit the hit on his cousin Willie Moretti. Not because of betrayal, but because Moretti had late-stage syphilis and was acting unstable. They called it an act of mercy. He was shot in the face at a restaurant. Flash forward to the 2000s, Sonny Franzese's son testified against his own father. Not once, but twice. That made him the first son of a mafia underboss to flip. At the time, Franzese was 93 and considered a legend. He'd partied with Sinatra and admitted to dozens of killings. Sonny threatened to crush his son like a bug. The kid had to enter witness protection, but years later they reconciled. When the 102-year-old mobster was released from prison, the reunion happened in a nursing home. Sonny had another son too, Michael Franzese. A former Capo regime, he was one of the richest mobsters in America in the 1980s. After prison, he turned to religion. left the life and now runs a YouTube channel with nearly 1.5 million subscribers. He talks about the real Goodfellas, no Hollywood gloss. And maybe if more mob guys had seen a shrink, a lot of deaths could have been avoided. Like in Analyze This or The Sopranos, where the mobster spills his guts at 10 a.m., then bashes someone's skull in by noon.
If a mob boss was ever visiting a psychiatrist, he'd be in the trunk of his car by the end of the week, along with a psychiatrist.
Sounds absurd, but Frank Costello actually did have a therapist in the mid-20th century. His shrink blabbed to the press. Costello didn't send a hit squad, he just cut him off for being unprofessional. No trunk, no cement shoes, just boundaries. So yeah, there's always a way out if you want one. People have been saying the mob movie genre is dead since Analyze This and The Sopranos debuted, but demand hasn't faded one bit. The Irishman was a hit in 2019. The Offer, the series about making The Godfather, came out just 3 years ago and ranked high on all the charts. And now, instead of watching fictional mob stories, you can just hop on YouTube and listen to actual ex-mobsters tell you how it all worked. Sometimes it's even better than a Scorsese flick. That's it for this one. Smash that like button, subscribe if you haven't, and share this video with your friends who are obsessed with mafia stories. Statistically, you've got a few of them. New videos coming soon. See you.